A former Chancellor admits an error with his own taxes set to run into millions. Nadhim Zahawi says it was a careless, not deliberate mistake, and sources tell ITV News Boris Johnson knew there was a problem.
I think his position is totally untenable, and more than that, actually. I think this brings into question the Prime Minister's judgment.
Also, delay means death. Ukraine urges the West to think faster and send battle tanks. More agencies joined the search for a missing British actor in the US. And
what a point.
Andy Murray puts up an impressive fight, but it isn't quite enough for the Australian Open.
This is ITV News with Gamal Fahnbulleh.
Good evening. The Conservative Party chairman, Nadhim Zahawi, appears to be battling to save his political career tonight after admitting he had to pay out for an error in his taxes. In a carefully worded statement, the former Chancellor, who was in charge of the country's taxation, insisted there was no foul play and that his mistake was careless and not deliberate. But he hasn't denied reports that millions of pounds were involved, some of it thought to be a fine. And tonight, ITV News can reveal Mr Zahawi's affairs were raised directly with the then Prime Minister Boris Johnson before his appointment as Chancellor. Here's our political correspondent, Carl Dinner.
Was it right for Nadhim Zahawi to have settled a dispute with HMRC whilst he was also in charge of HMRC as Chancellor? Until this afternoon, the government line on his tax affairs was simply this.
But what I know from what he's said is that he's paid all his tax, he's got no outstanding tax liabilities, and I think that's what people want to know.
But then Mr Zahawi released a statement saying that as he was being appointed Chancellor, the tax authorities had disagreed with him over how much of his multi-million-pound company YouGov belonged to his father rather than to him. He said they concluded that this was a careless and not deliberate error. So that I could focus on my life as a public servant, I chose to settle the matter and pay what they said was due, which was the right thing to do.
The other perspective.
Careless behaviour has a specific meaning within tax law.
So we have failure to take reasonable care, which is describing careless behaviour. So any kind of steps that we would have expected someone to reasonably have taken, but hasn't.
The former Chancellor has not said whether, as reported, he was handed a £1 million penalty by HMRC for this failure of care, and Labour say today's statement is far from the end of it.
I think his statement leaves even more questions than answers, quite honestly. It's a very murky affair, and I think his position is totally untenable. And more than that, actually, I think this brings into question the Prime Minister's judgment, and actually it should be that the Prime Minister now steps in and sacks him.
It does seem the issue was already known about in Number 10. This evening, sources told ITV News that before he appointed Mr Zahawi as Chancellor, Boris Johnson was alerted to the issue of his tax affairs by the government's propriety and ethics team.
And Carl is with me now. Carl, there's another set of revelations about Boris Johnson's own finances this evening.
Yes, that's right. The Sunday Times has been reporting that when Mr Johnson was Prime Minister, he had access to an £800,000 loan facility to help with his personal expenses, things like the renovation of that Downing Street flat. Now, the guarantor for that loan was a Canadian millionaire called Sam Blythe. The Sunday Times now reports that Mr Johnson was connected to Mr Blythe for the purposes of this by Richard Sharp. That's the same Richard Sharp who at the time was applying to become chairman of the BBC, the same Richard Sharp who then became chairman of the BBC. Now, today, Mr Sharp told the newspaper there was no conflict of interest. He said, "There is not a conflict when I simply connected at his request Mr Blythe with the Cabinet Secretary and had no further involvement whatsoever." And a spokesman for Boris Johnson said, "This is rubbish. There was never any remuneration or compensation to Mr Sharp from Boris Johnson for this or any other service." Labour do think there is a lot more to look at here, and tonight they have reported Boris Johnson over this to the Parliamentary Standards Commissioner.
Yeah, some questions to answer. OK, Carl, thank you. A senior advisor to President Zelensky has urged Ukraine's Western allies to think faster about sending modern battle tanks because indecision is killing people. A NATO summit yesterday failed to approve sending German-made Leopard tanks, which Kyiv considers essential to drive the Russian invaders back. Meanwhile, the UK Ministry of Defence said today that both sides appear to be massing significant forces in the south, possibly in preparation for a new spring offensive. Chloe Keedy has more.
In the abandoned buildings around the Chernobyl nuclear plant, Ukrainian troops are training, preparing for what might be to come. They're readying for a possible major Russian offensive this spring and say that to win, they need more and more modern weapons, especially battle tanks.
In terms of quality, of course, there is a big difference because the fire control systems of Western equipment are far superior to Russian weapons.
Despite pledging billions of dollars to help Ukraine at a summit in Germany yesterday, US and European leaders failed to sign off on a plan to provide it with the tanks it wants. Ukraine's president believes these German-made Leopards could be crucial in the next phase of this war.
The partners are firm in their attitude. They will support Ukraine as much as necessary for our victory. Yes, we will still have to fight for the supply of modern tanks, but every day we make it more obvious there is no alternative to making the decision on tanks.
But as fighting continues around the eastern town of Bakhmut, where today Russia claimed a small victory, one of the president's top advisors urged Ukraine's allies to act quickly, tweeting, "Today's indecision is killing more of our people. Every day of delay is the death of Ukrainians. Think faster." The UK Ministry of Defence said today that overall the two sides were in a state of deadlock, but that both are amassing forces, suggesting that either could be preparing to try and make a breakthrough soon. Chloe Keedy, ITV News.
The head of the Kurdish people smuggling ring who went on the run to escape jail has been arrested at Manchester Airport. 45-year-old Tariq Namik led an organised crime group which transported migrants to the UK in the backs of lorries. He was given an 8-year jail term in absentia after leaving the country last year. One of the richest women in Scotland, Dame Anne Gloag, has been charged with human trafficking. A spokesperson says the 80-year-old strongly disputes the malicious allegations against her. And the actor, Jeremy Renner, has revealed he broke more than 30 bones in a snowplow accident that nearly killed him. The Hawkeye star is recovering after he was accidentally run over by the 6-ton plough on New Year's Day. Now, more than a week after the British actor Julian Sands went missing in the mountains of Southern California, authorities there say there's still hope he could be found alive. Federal and state agencies have joined the efforts to find the 65-year-old, which is currently restricted to searching from the air. Harry Fawcett has the latest.
The search for Julian Sands has been stepped up, but it remains only from the air. The snowy terrain of California's San Gabriel Mountains too treacherous for rescue teams. Federal and state agencies now involved. Mobile phone forensics showing the 65-year-old was on the move into the mountains the day he vanished 8 days ago.
I want you to have your own thoughts and ideas and feelings, even when I hold you in my arms.
Perhaps the highlight of Sands' long career on screen was playing the romantic lead opposite Helena Bonham Carter in 1985's Room with a View. He spoke recently of the liberation that had come later in life with smaller roles, more adventurous choices. His parallel passion for hiking and mountaineering brought him to Mount Baldy, 50 miles northeast of his Los Angeles home. But recent severe weather has seen more than a dozen rescues here in the last month. 2 hikers have died.
During this time frame, especially after snowfall, there's going to be areas you think are good to hike on, but next thing you know, you're sliding. So recommended to come up in the springtime and the summertime and hike Baldy.
Sands' wife, the writer Evgenia Sitkovits, raised the alarm when he failed to return. So far, the only physical trace found has been his car. The local sheriff's department says even as it enters its second week, this remains a search and rescue mission. One friend tweeted about Sands' strength and his deep knowledge of the mountain, qualities it's hoped can keep him alive until he's found. Harry Fawcett, ITV News.
To sport now, and Newcastle are up to third place in the Premier League despite dropping points today. They drew 0-0 at Crystal Palace and had to thank their England goalkeeper Nick Pope for salvaging a point with a world-class save late in the game in front of watching England manager Gareth Southgate. Well, earlier, two of the ailing giants who Newcastle have leapfrogged this season met at Anfield, but neither Liverpool nor Chelsea could put their current struggles behind them. Here's Chris Cudder.
Two of the heavyweights of English football punching well below their weight in the Premier League. This was a fixture short on goals or wins for either side. Typical perhaps then that when Chelsea did get the ball in the net early on, it was disallowed by VAR for offside.
Kai Havertz's foot was a fraction ahead of the player.
Liverpool and some of their feared big names are simply misfiring. Chelsea's answer has been to spend, spend, spend. They've just broken the record for the most ever spent in a January transfer window. This was the first look at £85 million arrival from Ukraine, Mikhailo Mudryk. He looked skillful, but couldn't repay some of that huge fee with a goal.
What an introduction that would have been!
Liverpool's post-World Cup capture, Dutchman Cody Gakpo, fared little better. Chances came and chances went at both ends.
Alexander-Arnold!
Both out of form, these two giants are now in real danger of missing out on the Champions League places that brings in the money they need to stay competitive at the very top level. Chris Scudder, ITV News.
Finally, Andy Murray crashed out of the Australian Open today, but did so with such a strong performance that many of his fans hardly seemed to mind.
What a point.
So Andy was battling lack of sleep as well as his opponent, Roberto Bautista Agut, in the third round. He played two epic five-set matches already this week, the last one the longest of his career. And while the exhaustion showed between points, the Scot thrilled the crowd with his resilience until he finally succumbed in the fourth set.
You never know exactly when the end is going to be, but, you know, I would like to go out playing tennis like this, you know, where I'm competing with the best players in the world in the biggest events and doing myself justice.
And that is it. The national and local weather forecasts are next. From all of us here on the Weekend Team, many thanks indeed for watching. Bye-bye for now.